Once we've established our transfer goals, now we have to begin looking at what are the instructional strategies that we use in order to help students meet those transfer goals. So we're looking now at transfer strategies. If you remember from our first session when we talked about the three phases of learning, we mentioned that there are strategies that are best at each of the three phases of learning. So, if you're familiar with John Hattie's vast research on high impact strategies, you know that overall there are certain kinds of strategies that are determined to have a higher effect size than other strategies. But we have to be careful with that because sometimes the effectiveness of this strategy really depends on what it is that we want students to learn and at what level. So we noted, for example, that inquiry-based learning is sometimes lower on the effect size scale. Inquiry-based learning is not as good as direct instruction strategies for surface level understanding. But when we're moving to transfer, now we have a different set of strategies that we want to employ to help students move from surface to deep to transfer. So it's important, in other words, to match the right strategies with the phase of learning that we want students to be in. Julie Stern, the co-author of Visible Learning, among other books, has suggested to start with these three practical steps. Number one, write a big idea or conceptual relationship. Number two, turn it into an abstract conceptual question. And three, to use fact-rich context to illuminate the relationship. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. We're not eliminating knowledge. We're not eliminating facts from our curriculum. We're not simply teaching skills. But we want to take these fact-rich contexts and do something with them and show how they illustrate relationships. I put Julie Stern's Twitter handle there. I encourage you to follow her on Twitter. She has a lot of great ideas. She has, as I mentioned, a book on visible learning with John Hattie. She has a book on conceptual understanding and a new one coming out soon on transfer of learning. Now, I want us to visit just for a minute here our big 6 ideas and overarching essential questions. These are the ones that we established based on conversations that we had last year and incorporated into all of our course curricula for 612 social studies this year. So our big 6 ideas were change, democracy, diversity, evidence, justice, and power. And we established underneath that some critical, essential questions that go along with that. And those questions sometimes are historical in nature, but sometimes they're also philosophical or ethical kinds of questions or moral questions that we might ask. Remember, again, we aren't just talking about learning history for the sake of learning history or learning geography for the sake of learning geography. And so we aren't afraid in social studies education to ask questions about ethical or moral choices or civic choices, right? And so those can be used as a way of helping students to move from the conceptual relationships among these concepts to transfer in our contemporary society. So I would encourage you to dig deep into those, adapt them, and use them as you can as you're unpacking these concepts. Okay, let's get into then some specific instructional strategies. Identifying similarities and differences. Now, what that looks like in the classroom in transfer is a little bit different than it is in the deep phase. Here, students are drawing their own connections between concepts that are more temporally or conceptually removed from one another, and they're able to make their own analogies. So in the deep phase, we may be directing students to compare similar situations in The transfer phase, students have to come up with their own connections. For example, we looked at in our first session a teacher who used the idea of freedom and oppression in the 19th century as a conceptual organizer. And so, if we ask students to draw comparisons between Reconstruction and Native American treatment after the Civil War, that might be a deep connection, and we're asking students directly to identify similarities and differences. But if, as we're covering American history and we get to the civil rights movement, and students begin to think about how does what I learned in Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments bear on this understanding of civil rights, now they're drawing their own connections. And we might simply ask them to make connections between Reconstruction and another period in US history that we've studied. That would be an example of where students are doing it more independently. It's also important here for students to read across documents. That is, they read, investigate, and write across multiple documents, comparing historical accounts and perspectives, questioning sources, and corroborating or cross-checking their sources. So in deep learning, we talked about close reading and students really diving into a particular document in depth. Here, we're talking about being able to make comparisons across documents, across accounts, and consider different perspectives. A third strategy that works well in transfer is the Jigsaw Method. So we talked about Jigsaw before, where students form expert groups on a topic. Then they move to new groups to explain to their peers. But in the transfer phase, students return back to their expert groups and they make comparisons among the topics that their peers shared in their peer groups. So that takes it to another level. The jigsaw goes to another level where students begin to reflect on those new situations and make those comparisons. In transfer, we also think about debate or formal class discussions where students take a position on a controversial issue with a goal of persuading and refuting counter arguments to a position. Extended writing is also good for promoting transfer. Students write evidence-based essays like DBQ essays, for example, right? Because they're reading across documents, they're making arguments, they're incorporating evidence-based argumentation, they're using multiple sources, they're stating a thesis, and they're supporting it with evidence and reasoning. These are the kinds of strategies that promote not just deep understanding, comparing like concepts, but the ability to do this in contexts that are further removed from one another, and the ability to begin then to apply their understanding of concepts when they encounter new situations, whether it's in history class or whether it's in something in the contemporary world. And so we get back to those skill sets that we need that we talked about at the very beginning to look at these current events and issues that are happening in the world today and to figure out how I, as a student, can come to understand those. It's important in transfer that we have a strong relationship between what happens at the surface and deep level and our transfer phase or our new connections that we're drawing. And this is why I think reference tools become so important for students. We have to move students away from the idea that they are completing worksheets or taking notes just for the sake of completing an assignment. That these should become a kind of permanent reference tool, a permanent document for them that they continually reference in order to be able to make new connections. And I've just suggested a few here, whether students are doing their notes in interactive notebook format, where they might be doing left side and right side inputs and outputs, teacher-directed and student-directed notebooks. They may be organizing their ideas into various graphic organizers at the surface level. And during virtual learning, they may be doing that either of these interactive student notebooks, or they may be completing virtual graphic organizers in Google Drawings, for example. We put out a collection of those. Whether on the walls of the physical classroom or in your virtual classroom, if you have anchor charts that guide students, for example, through steps to consider the credibility of sources, or steps for close reading a document, right? Or you could put the big six ideas and overarching essential questions as a nice classroom poster that you can continually refer to, and that students can continually refer to in their own thinking. And then the processing activities. So when we take notes, we organize them into graphic organizers, and then we do some creative assignments associated with them. We write about them. We might produce something about them, maybe a video clip or a presentation about them. Maybe we draw a political cartoon, or we create a eulogy, or a report card for a particular leader. But those are the kinds of processing tasks that we do. And it's important to keep those and to be able to refer to those so that they talk to our new connections, so that when we have new situations, we can't remember all of the details and conceptual understandings that we've covered throughout the year off the top of our head, but we have these reference points to go back to. And this is what we do as adults in our own life. We don't remember everything that we learned, but we have reference points. And whether you kept all of your college notes from class like I have, or whether you simply know there's a certain reference tool where I can look something up online and find out the answer to it. I have a broad understanding of how this worked, but I don't necessarily remember all the particular details. So I go back to my tools and I look those up, and that helps me to be able to make those new connections. So I would encourage you to help students to think about those individual tasks that they're doing within given units as something that's permanent and a reference point for making new connections, and have students use those frequently so that they get in the habit of understanding what those are for. Another quote from Hattie and Stern: one limiting factor in fostering transfer lies in pairing the experience with the knowledge base of the learner. If the student has no related knowledge in it and experiences, transfer is not likely going to happen. As teachers, knowing the learner developmentally and experientially is essential when promoting transfer of learning. So I think back to our opening question in this session about whether or not computer apps can replace the teacher. And this is one of those areas where the computer app can never know the student the way you do as a teacher. And this is why it's so critical in pedagogical content knowledge that we not forget that there's a student context, that we understand the experiences that students bring to the table. We understand where they are developmentally, and we understand their life experiences. And that's how we help to promote transfer. I'd like us to go to our final breakout of the session. And now I'd like you to think about, what are some of your transfer goals? What strategy do you use to help students transfer their learning to new contexts? And then I want you to look at this page on the Social Studies Teaching and Learning Strategies page. And I want you to look at and see which of these strategies. There are 50 strategies here that I've organized into 5 different categories. But I want you to see, which of these strategies do you think you could employ in order to best promote transfer of learning? So we'll go into our third breakout now, and our final breakout, with these questions in mind.